I recently acquired a new roommate. His name was Greg. He told me that he had some strange sleeping behaviors. He would sleepwalk and he had night terrors. Funny thing was, I also had a history of sleepwalking, but only on rare occasions. The first incident occurred about 1 week later when I heard him screaming in the middle of the night. Since we slept on different sides of the house, the screams sounded distant, but enough to scare me so much I ran to check on him. As I'd get closer to his bedroom, he stopped screaming, so I just went back to bed. For the next month, he had no issues. I noticed that he had no friends or family that would visit, and I never saw or heard him on the phone or texting. Then, another random night, Greg started screaming. Same thing. I got up and started to go to his room, but he would stop. Then one night, I was awoken by screaming in my bedroom. I couldn't see anything in the panic, so I turned on the bedside lamp, and he was at the foot of my bed, wearing pajamas. It scared the hell out of me, so I started screaming and woke him up. He apologized, and then went back to bed. Then, the scariest thing happened. About 2 nights later, I awoke to clanking. It sounded like tools and hammers tapping. I turned on the light to see Greg kneeling down in a corner, working on something with his hands. A few seconds after turning the light on, Greg froze and then slowly turned his upper body around and stared blankly at me while I lay in my bed. I was beyond creeped out, so I slowly slid out of bed and left the house. After sleeping in my truck down the road in an empty church parking lot, I returned to the house at about 8 in the morning. Greg was gone. All of his belongings were gone. No signs of him anywhere. It was like he never lived there. I didn't know of any of his friends or family, so I had no one to call and ask about him. When I moved out after the lease was up, I was moving furniture out of my bedroom. In the corner of the room where I last saw Greg kneeling down, I realized the floor vent for the air conditioning was loose. Inside the floor vent was an envelope with a ton of pictures of me sleeping. The pictures had handwritten dates and times written on the back. The only other item was a whittled down wooden broom handle brought to a point. I truly believe Greg was preparing to kill me that night. It appears Greg had been coming to my room almost nightly and working on making the broom handle a stabbing weapon, and I never heard until the last night I saw him. I work the PM shift and get done around midnight. I was walking into the grocery store when a man from across the parking lot started catcalling. I can deal with this. As a woman, I'm used to it. But he started walking quickly towards me, and I got a little nervous. It's midnight. It's dark. I'm on edge. He starts commenting on my hair. It was dyed green at the time, saying that he likes my scrubs from work and asking if I have a boyfriend. I blow him off and go into the store. I come out about 15 minutes later, and he's still there, standing in the row about 20 feet from my car. He starts up with the same stuff. I'm trying to smile and laugh it off, even though I'm pretty sure he's going to murder me at this point. I get to my door and he says, "Hey, Lee." I slowly turned and he walks up to me and says, in a very sinister voice, "Yeah, I know you." I asked him how he knew my name, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about it." I was frozen and about to push the panic button on my car alarm when his mood suddenly goes from crazy serial killer rapist to goofy best friend. He lightly pats me on the arm and says, "Ah, don't worry. You're good people." He then proceeds to ask me if I have any cocaine, which I did not. He got into a car and drove away. A few years ago, my wife and I went to a haunted corn maze a couple days before Halloween. We had been drinking a little bit, so we managed to get lost as hell. We had wandered around for about 20 minutes when this weird-looking guy starts following us around. We made a turn and ended up at a dead end. When we turn around to find another way, the guy was right there. Really calmly, he looked at both of us and said, "Some psycho could come in here and kill people. Everyone would just think it's part of the show." It scared the shit out of us. I have no idea if the guy worked for the maze or what, but we got the hell out of there by cheating and walking through the walls of the maze. I pride myself on my car trip taking patience. I never rush. I take frequent breaks, and I try to generally enjoy the car trip as much as possible. Sometimes this leads to me staying overnight in random hotels in Connecticut. My friend's wedding came and went, and I needed to get home as I didn't really know my friend's family all that well. I was getting very tired and my eyes started to close, and I began driving off the road. As I'm not really anywhere near home, I figure I'll stop at the first hotel I can find. My GPS guides me to a Best Western, but it's all booked up for a biker gang weekend. The next hotel I find is off the beaten path and very quaint. It's late, and I'm so tired, I don't really care, so I check in, and they hand me a key. A real, made of metal, old-fashioned looking key. That's the kind of place this was. I found my room, unlocked it, walked in, relocked the door, which there was no deadbolt or safety chain, and then sent a quick text to my wife to let her know I wasn't going to be home until tomorrow afternoon. And then I crashed. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, I woke up. I'm not really sure why I woke up, but I found I couldn't get back to sleep. Everything was too quiet. I usually sleep at home with a box fan for white noise, but here there was nothing. No air conditioner to hum loudly, no refrigerator to hum, no neon lights to buzz noisily outside my window. The night was still. What's weird is that I never heard footsteps or a car. You would think that it being so quiet, I would have heard something, but all I heard was the sound of a key rattling in the lock to my door. It seemed to take an extraordinary amount of time, so long that I remember clearly having the thought, someone must just have the wrong room. I was just building up the courage to shout when the key clicked. For 3 seconds or so, which seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. And then the doorknob turned. I'm not sure if the moon was super bright that night, or if I had been tossing and turning so long that the sun had just started to come up, but I could see the outline of this person. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or so. He was wearing a hat, a baseball cap. Whoever it was had long hair down to their shoulders. They were thin, but not skinny, and they must have had a quilted vest on or something, because they seemed kind of knobby around the shoulder area. In my head, I've gone over the next 30 seconds a trillion times. In my head, I get up and run to the door and shout and raise a scene. I'm brave and I scare this person off, or at least turn on a light and let them know that they shouldn't be here. I am courageous in the face of this unexpected intruder. In reality, I lie there. I hold my breath. I don't move a muscle. My eyes feel like they should fall out because I have them opened so wide, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. To have some detail come into focus that would right this so obviously wrong scene. Nothing happens. The figure stands in the doorway. I know it's just my eyes playing tricks on me, but his fingers seem to start growing. The person isn't moving, just standing there with arms by their side, like they're posing for creepy stalker magazine. And so we sit there. I'm not sure how long. Time in situations like this really hammers home that it is a construct of human imagination. There is no measurement here. A lifetime passes. Finally, the figure clears their throat. An ugly, guttural sound. They turn around and walk away, leaving my door wide open. I spend about 30 seconds just sitting there, waiting for my heart to calm down, or maybe trying to convince myself that it was a dream, to put enough temporal distance from the event that the edges of unreality creep in. Eventually, I climb slowly from the bed, convinced that a noise is going to alert the figure that I am here, and yes, I am very edible. I grab my bag, creep out to my car, and I drive away as fast as I possibly can. Later, I get a bill from the hotel for $20 to replace the key that I drove away with. When I was a teenager, my grandfather, my mom's dad, started suffering from dementia and came to live at our house for a few years. It was a nice time being with him, but it was also sad watching him decline. The dementia went mostly as expected, strangely misplaced items, and general confusion. But there was one really weird thing that my grandfather did that really disturbed me and my mom. One day, he started talking about Connie. "Where did she go?" he asked. We thought he was talking about my deceased grandmother, but her name was Anne. No one in our family was named Connie, so we figured he was just confused. But he kept asking about Connie. I started wondering if Connie was some woman that had been in his life that none of us had ever known about. The weird stuff started happening shortly after. He would randomly have his shoes already tied by seemingly no one. He had long ago lost the motor skills to do it himself, and when asked about it, he would of course say Connie tied them. One day, he casually explained that there would be a storm coming, and shortly after, it came. Again, he said Connie told him. There were lots of little things like this, furniture and doors moving around, mysterious footsteps at night, and always, he would say it was Connie. My mom and I started to think of Connie as some kind of ghost or angel looking after him in his old age. Until one day, he was talking about Connie, and he grabbed my hand suddenly and looked at me with his eyes wide and his lip trembling. He looked terrified. "Where's Connie?" he asked as usual. "She's not here," I said, which was my usual answer. "Quick, shut the door. Don't let her find me. Quick, before she gets me again." A creepy feeling came over me. "Who is Connie?" I asked for the millionth time, but he just put his hands over his face and started to rock back and forth, moaning. After that, we heard less about Connie, but mostly because we were too creeped out to keep asking about the weird noises and the random things that he seemed to know. However, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps and scratching. The footsteps were fast, like someone was running around the house. I hesitated to leave my room scared of what I would find. I saw a figure down the hall, turning around the corner, and I almost stopped there and shut my bedroom door when I heard my grandfather's moaning and realized the figure was him. "Grandpa?" I asked as I went over to him. He was scratching frantically at something. "What is it?" I touched him on the shoulder, and he turned around, startled. On the table was a ripped-out page from a magazine ad of a woman. He had scribbled in pen all over her eyes. "Connie's eyes," he whispered. "Her eyes are missing. Why won't she leave me alone?" My mother and I had no real way of comforting my grandfather through these nightmares and terrors that he was experiencing. The doctors said that it was normal for him at this stage, and we all sensed that he had little time left. When he died a few months later in the hospital, the nurses told us that he called out Connie's name in his worst times. My mother and I don't really talk about it anymore, and we just figure that it was all a symptom of his dementia. But sometimes, when I hear weird sounds in the middle of the night, I think that maybe Connie is still with me, waiting to torment me with the big gaping holes where her eyes should be. When I was little, my family had a weekend cottage in the mountains of Vermont. Back then, it was still to some extent the back country and quite unspoiled. Our cottage was surrounded by woods, and there was a gravel road that formed a horseshoe where about 7 or 8 neighboring cottages were. Oftentimes there was nobody in those cottages, and we were pretty much alone for miles. Needless to say, nighttime was extremely dark. One summer night, we're all sitting around the orange shag carpeting and watching Star Trek or something, and someone knocks softly at the screen door. It's a woman wearing a house dress and looking very sweaty and out of breath. I must have been about 7 years old and had a brother slightly older. My dad talks to her for a little while as she explains that she needs a lift down to the village. My dad, ever the good Samaritan, says sure, no problem, let me get my keys. They both leave in my dad's Cutlass, leaving my mom, my brother and I sitting still with the screen door open, watching TV on this warm but pitch black summer night. Meanwhile, my father is driving this woman down to the village, a good 30 minutes each way, and he begins to talk to her and pay closer attention to her. He notices that she is barefoot and her dress is all torn and muddy. She explains that her husband lives with her in a cabin in the woods, and they have had a huge fight, and that she has run away through the woods since he was trying to kill her. She has lost her shoes in the woods and ran through brambles and branches in her panic to escape. Now, my dad is at least 30 minutes from home, and he knows that the first house a murderous guy would encounter as he chased his wife through the woods would be our cottage, where we're all still sitting around, completely oblivious, with every door and window wide open. Cell phones haven't even been dreamt of yet in this era, and he has no way to reach us. He drives the woman to some friend's house, urges her to call the cops, and drives back to the cottage, wondering if he's going to be greeted by our massacred corpses. It was a different era, I guess, because it never occurred to anyone to call the cops just in case. I still remember him getting home and trying calmly to lock every door, and sitting by the door, trying not to convey to us how scared he was. That's not even the creepiest part, though. A couple of days later, my brother and I were looking around the outside of the cottage, and we noticed hand and face marks on the back windows where a tall person had pressed his face against the glass. We also explored the woods over that summer, and actually found the woman's shoes stuck in the mud, as well as their utterly trashed cabin. Someone had absolutely destroyed the place, breaking every glass and picture frame and throwing all their belongings out into the woods. That was one creepy place. We heard later that the woman had committed suicide. For years afterward, my dad and I would often walk the dog out on the gravel road, and at the turn of the horseshoe that was closest to where these people's cabin was, we always got a really bad feeling. They were long gone, but the hairs would stick up on the back of my neck, and I would always feel watched and terrified. I always assumed my dad, a calm and rational guy, if there ever was one, didn't feel scared. But years later, he confided in me that he always hated that spot and felt very bad vibes. Some kind of immense sense of foreboding when we walked by there. We met an agent who showed us this building, and when I tried to verify the price with her, she said it was actually several $100s cheaper than that. It was strange. Every other place that we saw had lines of people and tons of competition, but strangely, we were the only ones there. She immediately called us after we left and said that we could have the apartment. We were ecstatic. When we filled out all of the forms later, she mentioned that there was a building manager who lived there. He was friends with the owner, who was a very old woman. He was also very old, but we should give our rent checks to him and let him know if we needed anything. Living there started off fine. The apartment was a little weird and even had an electrical socket in the shower, which I tried to cover and make waterproof. The manager, though, was strange. You couldn't say exactly why he was strange, but there was something off about him. One day he would nod in our direction if we saw him, and other days we would hear him mumbling incoherently at people that weren't there. The few times we went to him with a problem, he would start yelling, almost like in a different language. One day, though, we were startled by a loud banging on our door. It was him. I was terrified and made my husband open the door. He screamed and raved about a note that we left on a car that was blocking our garage door, which was apparently his car. He wasn't making any sense, but it was terrifying. He told us that he would make us pay if we ever left a note on his car again. Here's where it gets scary. I had been trying to avoid him as much as I could at this point. He seemed unhinged somehow. There was a look in his eyes. Something wasn't right, and it was obvious that he was very angry with us. One night, I woke in the dead of the night to a noise in our hallway. We had wood floors, and they creaked when you walked on them. They were creaking. My husband was dead asleep. I had a history of being paranoid, so I closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep, telling myself it was nothing. That's when the feeling of absolute horror and fear seized me. It's unlike anything I have ever felt before. I can't even describe it, except that I was terrified, and I couldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed. I did manage to open my eyes, even though part of me didn't want to. And he was standing there, next to the bed, watching me. I laid there in complete panic, unable to move, and he stood there. He looked like a shadow. He shifted his feet. The floor creaked. He was breathing hard. I wanted to scream or do something, but I couldn't. It felt like it lasted forever. Finally, I just closed my eyes again, unable to even pray. I was so scared. The floor creaked again. I opened my eyes. He was gone. I laid awake the rest of the night. The horrible fear that pressed against me was gone, and I was able to move again. Tears poured down my face the rest of the night. That was all I could do. The next morning, I looked at the front door, and the latch was still set. No one would have been able to open the door from the outside and get in without breaking it. I tried to convince myself that it was just a terrible dream, but I knew I was awake. It happened. We moved shortly after that. When we went to give notice to the manager, he smiled creepily and said, "Now that's a shame. You've been such good tenants." He looked at me. "Didn't you love it here?" This happened about 4 years ago. I live in a resort community and started working for a local real estate agent, taking photos of homes for sale. I usually photographed 3 or 4 homes a week, lakefronts and shacks alike. I had seen unusual things, like the occasional hidden room or unique art collection that was left behind, but I had never encountered anything scary until this happened. It was a summer day, warm and bright. I knew the neighborhood I was heading to and had no concerns about safety. The area was very suburban for the mountain, with a large park and school nearby. I packed up my camera and drove 20 minutes to the home. Upon arrival, I began my session by taking pictures of the exterior. Nothing was out of the ordinary. After struggling to navigate the sharp slope that the home was on, I managed to snap pictures of its sides and its rear deck. It was time now for interior shots. I proceeded to the front door, entered the lockbox code, and tried to unlock the front door. As I fumbled with it, I felt overwhelmingly uncomfortable. Something washed over me in that moment, and I knew that I shouldn't be there. I finally opened the door and found a house completely destroyed. The living room was a sea of debris. An EMT board lay in the middle of the room, with a charred doll beside it. Holes littered the walls. Light bulbs were smashed all over. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. I observed all of this without taking a single step further. I immediately closed the door, walked to my car as fast as I could, and called the agent. I told the agent that she would need to find someone else to take pictures of this house. She asked why, and as I tried to explain it to her, I realized I sounded a little crazy. How can you professionally describe to someone the feeling of being scared shitless for no apparent reason other than a disgustingly filthy house? She told me she had seen homes that were less than welcoming, but we both had a job to do, and she couldn't complete hers without me completing mine. I left the property, but decided I didn't want to lose my job over this. I called my father, who lived locally, and asked if he'd accompany me to the house. In all my days, I had never heard my dad discuss anything remotely spooky. He's a very no-nonsense kind of man, and simply wouldn't tolerate talk of ghosts. Therefore, I thought that he would be perfect for this assignment. He'd keep my head in the game, for sure. I arranged to pick him up at his house in 30 minutes. My heart sank a little as I pulled up to my parents' house, and my dad's truck was gone. My mom came running out, purse in hand, and told me that my father had to leave for work reasons, but that she would go with me instead. She brought along a flashlight and assured me that I would be just fine. As we drove to the house, I described to her what had happened. Her cheeriness level came down a few notches, and I could tell that she was slightly unnerved. We parked in front of the house, and I knew that she didn't want to go inside. I didn't want her to go in either. She came up with a solution. She'd call my cell phone and talk to me as I walked through the house. She would stand right outside the front door. I answered her call, turned on my flashlight, and headed inside. Again, immediately upon entering, I was scared. And just for clarification, I am not easily scared. I am not one to see or feel things of that nature. Ever. So the fact that I was actually feeling something terrified me. By this time it was later in the day, and the house was positioned in such a way that it was completely shaded from the sun. The electricity was off and it was dark. Very dark. My mother was on the phone telling me to breathe. "I can't hear you breathing. Are you that scared? Is it that bad?" I had a hard time speaking as I took in all that I saw. The toilets were completely black on the inside. The kitchen had blackish reddish smears all over the counters and walls. Children's toys were mixed in with porn magazines lying on the floor. I just kept clicking, taking pictures, trying not to focus on any one of the deeply disturbing things inside this house. I went as quickly as I could through the main level. I then came to a set of stairs leading down. I told my mother through the cell phone that I was heading down. She continued to reassure me and told me to hurry up and just get it over with. I began walking extremely cautiously down the steps, one at a time. The steps led to a landing and then turned the corner, so all I could see was a white wall at the bottom. I had this immense feeling that I was going to see something horrific once I turned that corner. I was 2 or 3 steps away from the landing when I heard it. A scream coming from my phone. Not a mild scream, but a blood-curdling scream like someone was being murdered on the other end of the line. My mom. I have never ran, nor have I since, as fast as I did running up those stairs. I completely expected to find my mom laying lifeless just outside the house. I got to the top of the stairs, and there she was, standing there, looking completely terrified and perplexed. I grabbed her hand and we ran to the car. We drove for nearly 5 minutes before one of us said anything. Then she turned to me and said, "Tell me why you were screaming." I told her that I thought it was her. Neither of us were screaming, but both of us for a certainty heard a woman screaming for her life on that phone. We stopped at a grocery store parking lot and just sat there, trying to catch our breath. When I got home, I uploaded the pictures without actually looking at them and sent them to the real estate agent. I told her she would have to do the editing on her own, as I would not have them on my computer. I then deleted the email and every single image. Because of that, I don't know the address of the house, nor have I driven by it since. In hindsight, I would have liked to research the history of the property. I'll never know what happened there. A while ago, during the NHL lockout, I was up at 3 in the morning watching the World Juniors, and I noticed this van pull into my cul-de-sac, which was very strange, because I didn't recognize the van, because it wasn't any of my neighbors. Then the van stops right in front of my house, and 3 people get out. 2 of the people go to my neighbor's house to my right, and the other comes to mine. They're all dressed in black, and they're going pretty quickly. I was pretty much frozen when I heard his footsteps as he came closer to my door. And then nothing happened. Literally nothing. The van drove away without anyone getting back in. I never saw the guy leave my doorstep. It was snowing that night, so in the morning I had to go shovel my driveway. and I saw his steps go to my front door and stop. There were no tracks leaving my front door, nor were there any anywhere else. I remember when I was very young, maybe 3 years old, I used to see the corner of my bedroom ceiling peel back, and an old lady would look through and laugh at me. It would make me scream and cry. I don't know if it was a dream or something I imagined while I was awake, but I am pretty old now, and I still remember it vividly. I was never much afraid of anything, an avid hiker, a championship swimmer, and I even went skydiving once, but I was never as terrified as I was when someone decided to terrorize me in my home 2 years ago. I'll never forget the first night that it happened. It was a Sunday. My parents took off to England that afternoon to visit my elderly grandmother who still lived there. Since they'd be gone a week and a half, and I had a new job that I couldn't take time off of yet, I was to stay home and look after the house. I was just out of college a few months prior and still living at home while I saved up for a place of my own. The property my parents lived on was fairly isolated. It had a long, winding driveway that extended about a half a mile from the road. Our nearest neighbor was probably 2 miles away. In the living room, the couch was right under a big bay window, and that's where I found myself on this particular night. I was flipping through channels on my parents' 55-inch TV while sipping wine, glancing through the texts on my phone. It was a quiet night. Just one text from my boss. "Maggie, can you be at work at 8:30 tomorrow instead of 9? The answer, of course, was yes. I must have dozed off and woke up around midnight. I clicked off the TV, and too lazy to go upstairs to my bedroom, I turned back over on the couch and went back to sleep. I woke up suddenly at 3:32 a.m. A loud noise jolted me out of a sound sleep. It took me about 15 seconds to process that someone was at the window, directly above me, pounding on the glass repeatedly. My blood ran cold, and I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The window was positioned in such a way that while it was right above the couch, someone looking in shouldn't be able to see me without lights, or unless I moved. I stayed completely still as the pounding continued. I was so terrified, I didn't even want to use my phone because I didn't want whoever it was out there to see the light. After about 2 minutes of pounding on the glass, tears in my eyes, the terror grew to an unimaginable level when I heard a second person pounding on the front door. The front door was on the same wall as the bay window. It took everything in me not to scream, but at the same time, I don't think I could have screamed even if I tried. This went on for 45 minutes, until about 4:15 when the bangs abruptly stopped. I had so much adrenaline running through my body, I couldn't bring myself to even look at my phone until daylight, which came around 7 a.m. This was winter in northern Michigan, and this was private property. There was no reason anyone should have been outside in freezing temperatures, pounding on my parents' window. Thankfully, my parents' garage is connected directly to our house, otherwise I probably wouldn't have gone to work. As I backed out of the garage, everything looked completely normal. It had been too cold to snow in this past week, so there were no footprints. I tried to rationalize what happened all day at work. I absent-mindedly answered the phone, made copies, and tried to pinpoint who could have been out there. It wasn't my parents, as they alerted me the day that they had landed safely in London. Besides that fact, They of course had keys. All of my friends were out of town that I knew of, and none of them are the type to do that. I really didn't want to go back to the house alone that night after work, but by the time I had picked up some Chinese takeout, gotten home, locked all the doors and checked twice, and poured myself a big glass of wine, I was calming down a little. I told myself it must have been a fluke. Some idiots messing around drunk. It didn't make any sense why drunk people would be on our property in the middle of the night. But who knows? Maybe it was someone attempting to be funny and failing miserably. I drew the curtains and kept the TV on all night this time. But at around 2:10 a.m., I knew what had happened had not been a fluke. Because it happened again, pounding on the same window for about half a minute, and then pounding at the front door. Carefully this time, I picked up my phone and dialed 911. It wasn't until about 2:45 that the police showed up, and the knocking had ceased about 15 minutes prior. I begged them to look around the property, which they did. This is the part where I wish I could tell you that they found some dumb teenagers out in the woods, not wanting to get caught smoking by their parents, who wanted to scare the shit out of a young woman by herself, but they didn't. They found no sign of anyone. The next day, I had a very awkward conversation with a male coworker of mine. I knew that Jeff was single and had a place in the city. I let him in on what was going on, and he was genuinely concerned. "I hate to ask this of you," I said, hands trembling, "but do you think you could stay over?" Jeff showed up at about 8 p.m. with some snacks. We ended up talking until 1 a.m. and then falling asleep on separate couches in the living room. Nothing happened, and Jeff stayed with me for the next 3 nights, and nothing happened. I bought him lunch on Friday at work for all his trouble. By then, my parents were due back in town the following Sunday, late. I was starting, if you can believe it, to feel slightly better. Then it happened again. 1:37 a.m., pounding on the bay window in the living room. By this time, I was not only afraid, but also livid. I pushed the fear aside and let the anger do the talking. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "What the hell do you want from me? Get the hell off my property, or I will blow your head off. I'm armed." Honestly, I was not armed, but as angry as I felt, I wanted to fight off whoever was out there. I thought for just a moment that was it, but not 3 minutes of silence passed, and there was pounding on both the glass and the front door, and then someone started banging on the side of the house. That's when I realized whoever was out there was trying to terrify me. This was not simply some dumb kids having a laugh. This was a psycho, a group of psychos that knew I was alone and knew I was terrified. Hiking some of the most treacherous trails Michigan had to offer, nor swimming across the lake every year for swim team in college, nor jumping out of a plane, the earth getting closer and closer, could not have prepared me for the fear that I felt that week. The day my parents got back, my dad went into the city and bought 2 motion lights and had surveillance cameras installed at the front and back of the house. Later that month, he bought a gun. I rest easy now, knowing that these things exist, but I will never forget the feeling of utter terror I experienced those nights. That was 2 years ago, and since then there had been no incident. I moved to the city in a small apartment, surrounded by neighbors and noise. Who terrorized me on that string of nights remains a mystery. They say that the only thing to fear is fear itself. But right now, my biggest fear is not knowing. In 1997, I was 17 years old. I was driving my girlfriend at the time home late one night, and we are sitting at a stoplight at an overpass above a freeway. An 80s Dodge Omni comes flying up to the light across from us and barely comes to a stop while the light is still red. I look across at the driver and he looks panicked, and I look over at the passenger, and that's when shit got real. There was a girl with duct tape wrapped around her face and shoulders. Her hair was all messed up, and she was crying. It took me a few seconds to even process what I was seeing. I looked at my girlfriend, and she looked at me and then burst out crying and said, "What the hell is going on in that car?" No sooner do I look back, the guy has already turned the wrong way onto a one-way street. I freaked out. I threw my car in reverse. I tried backtracking and flying down city streets to catch up with him. We did see him at one point in time hit a turnaround onto 8 Mile. He didn't have a plate on his car. I hurried up and went home. I rushed in and called the cops while my girlfriend frantically tried telling my mom what we saw. The cops came. They took our story. There was never a missing person story that matched what we said. My mom never quite believed us. It was written off as two teens with overactive imaginations. I know what I saw. I'm a man in my 30s, and I'll never forget the look on that girl's face, the crazy in that guy's eyes. My girlfriend, who later became my wife, remembers it vividly too. That was one of the craziest nights of both of our lives. I went outside early one morning and saw this woman kneeling in my mother's flower garden. I was a little creeped out. I was about 10 years old, and a person I didn't know was just sitting in the middle of our garden. Not knowing what to do, I just said hello to her. She turned around and immediately apologized for being in our yard and said that we had such nice flowers, she couldn't help it. Then she walked away. I didn't think much of it and went about my day. My mom and dad left to do errands and my brother and I were home alone. We were both watching TV, and without any warning, someone taps my shoulder from behind me. I turn around, and the woman is standing behind me. She apologized and then asked where my mom and dad were. I told her that they would be back any time, but that she really shouldn't be in our house. She asked for a pen and a piece of paper, saying that she wanted to write them a note. I complied and told her to do it out in the dining room. I peered from behind a corner in my hallway and never let her out of my sight. I was beyond afraid. She calmly sets the pen down and then walks out the front door. I bolt to the window and make sure she's gone, and then I go to the door and lock it. And then I nervously and very slowly approach the note she left on the table. I read it and was dumbfounded. She said that she believed God spoke to her in the garden and told her to build an altar for her grandmother. The note was her scheduling an appointment with my mother to discuss placing a tombstone and a prayer table in the garden. My parents got home and I told them what happened. She left her phone number on the note. My mom took the day off, sat out on the porch at the time the woman said, and waited for her to arrive. She never showed up. My mom called the number on the note only to get a disconnected message. The only proof I had of any of these things happening was the note she left. My mom and dad don't believe most of the story, and it seems even my brother forgot about it. But it happened. This crazy woman came into our house in the middle of the day and then gently tapped my shoulder.
I am a nurse. I was taking a call one night and woke up at 2 in the morning for a general surgery call. It was pretty vague, But at the time, I lived in a town that had a large population of young military guys and avid meth users, so late night emergencies were common. I got to the hospital, where a few more details awaited me. Perirectal abscess. For the uninitiated, this means that somewhere in the immediate vicinity of the arsehole, there was a pocket of pus that needed draining. Needless to say, our entire crew was less than thrilled. I went down to the emergency room to transport the patient, and the only thing the ER nurse said as she handed me the chart was, "Have fun with this one." Among healthcare professionals, vague statements like that were a bad sign. My patient was a 314-pound Native American woman who could barely fit onto the stretcher which I was transporting her on. She was rolling frantically side to side and moaning in pain, pulling at her clothes and muttering Hail Marys. I could barely get her name out of her after asking her a few times, just so that I could confirm her identity with her and what we were working on. I figured it was just best that we get her to the anesthesiologist so that we could knock her out and get the circus started. She continued her theatrics the entire 10-minute ride to the OR, nearly falling off the surgical table as we were trying to put her under anesthetic. We see patients like this a lot. Chronic drug abusers who don't handle pain very well, and who have used so many drugs that even increased levels of pain medication don't touch, simply because of high tolerance levels. It should be noted, tonight's surgical team was not exactly wet behind the ears. I'd been working in healthcare for several years already, mostly psych and medical settings. I've watched an 8-year-old man tear a 1-diameter catheter balloon out of his penis while screaming, "You'll never make me talk." I've been attacked by a HIV-positive neo-Nazi, and I've seen some other shit. The other nurse had been in the OR as a trauma specialist for over 10 years. The anesthesiologist had done residency at a level 1 trauma center, or as we like to call them, knife and gun clubs. The surgeon was ex-army, and averaged about 8 words and 2 facial expressions a week. None of us expected what was about to happen. We got the lady off to sleep, put her in the stirrups, and I began washing the rectal area. It was red and inflamed, and a little bit of pus was seeping through it. But it was all pretty standard. Her chart had noted that she had been injecting IV drugs through her perineum, so this was obviously an infection from dirty needles or bad drugs, but overall, it didn't seem to warrant her repeated cries of "Oh Jesus, kill me now." The surgeon stepped up with a scalpel, sinks just the tip in, and at that exact same moment, the patient had a muscle twitch in her diaphragm, and just like that, all hell broke loose. Unbeknownst to us, the infection had actually tunneled nearly a foot into her abdomen, creating a vast cavern full of pus, rotten tissue, and fecal matter that had seeped outside of her colon. This godforsaken mixture came rocketing out of that little incision like we were recreating the funeral scene from Jane Austen's Mafia. We all wear waterproof gowns, face masks, glove, hats, the works, all of which were as helpful as rain boots against a fire hose. The bed was in the middle of the room, an easy 7 feet from the nearest wall, but by the time we were done, I was still finding bits of rotten flesh pasted against the back wall. As the surgeon continued to advance his blade, the torrent just continued. The patient kept seizing against the ventilator, which is not uncommon in surgery, and with every muscle contraction, she shot more of this blackish grey-brown fluid out onto the floor, until, within 10 minutes, It was seeping into the other nurse's shoes. I was nearly 12 feet away, jaw dropped open, within my surgical mask, watching the second nurse dry heave, and the surgeon standing on tiptoes keeping this stuff from soaking his socks any further. The smell hit them first. Oh God, I just threw up in my mask. The other nurse was out. She tore off her mask and sprinted out of the room, shoulders still heaving, mouth still wide open, not being able to believe the volume of fluid this woman's body contained. It was like getting a great big bite of the despair and apathy that permeated this woman's life. I couldn't breathe. My lungs simply refused to pull any more of that stuff in. The anesthesiologist went down next, an ex-NCAA D1 tailbacked, his 6'2" frame shaking as he threw back the door to the OR suite in an attempt to get more air in, letting me glimpse the second nurse still throwing up in the sink outside the door. Another geyser of pus splashed across the front of the surgeon. In all operating rooms everywhere in the world, regardless of socialized or privatized, secular or religious, big or small, there is one thing the same. Somewhere there is a bottle of peppermint concentrate. Everyone in the department knows where it is. Everyone knows what it's for, and everyone prays to their gods that they never have to use it. In times like this, we rub it on the inside of our masks to keep the outside smell at bay for long enough to finish the procedure and shower off. I sprinted to our central supply, ripping the open drawer where the vial of ambrosia was kept, and was greeted by an empty box. The bottle had been emptied but not replaced. Somewhere out there was a godless bastard who had used the last of the peppermint oil and not replaced a single drop of it. To this day, if I figure out who it was, I will kill them with my bare hands, but not before cramming their heads up the colon of every meth user I can find, just so that we're even. I darted back into the room with the next best thing I could find, a vial of Mastisol, which is an adhesive rub we use sometimes for bandaging. It's not as good as peppermint, but now considering that over 1/3 of the floor was now thoroughly coated in what could easily be mistaken for a combination of bovine afterbirth and maple syrup, we were out of options. I started rubbing as much of the Mastisol as I could get on the inside of my mask, just glad to be smelling anything except whatever slimy demon spawn we just cut out of this woman. The anesthesiologist grabbed the vial next, dousing the front of his mask in it, so that he could stand next to his machines, long enough to make sure that the woman didn't die on the table. It wasn't until later that we realized that Mastisol can give you a mild high from huffing it, but in retrospect, that's probably what got us through it. By this time, the smell had permeated out of our OR suite and down the 40-foot hallway to the front desk, where the other nurse still sat, eyes bloodshot and watery, clenching her stomach desperately. Our suite looked like the underground river of ooze from Ghostbusters 2, except dirty. Oh, so dirty. I stepped back into the OR suite, not wanting to leave the surgeon by himself, in case he genuinely needed help. It was like one of those overly artistic representations of zombie apocalypse you see on fan forums. Here is one guy, in blue surgical garb, standing nearly ankle deep in lumps of dead tissue, fecal matter, and several liters of syrupy infection. He was performing surgery in the swamps of Dagobah, except the swamps had just come out of this woman's arse, and there was no Yoda. He and I didn't say a word for the next 10 minutes, as he scraped the inside of the abscess until all the dead tissue was out. The front of his gown was a gruesome mix of brown and red, his eyes squinting against the stinging vapors originating directly in front of him. I finished my required paperwork as quickly as I could and helped him stuff the recently vacated opening full of gauze and taped this woman's buttocks closed to hold the dressing for as long as possible. Woke her up and immediately shipped her to the recovery ward. Until then, I'd only heard of alcohol showers. Turns out 70% of isopropyl alcohol is about the only thing that could even touch a scent like that once it's soaked into your skin. It takes 4 to 5 bottles to get really clean, but it's worth it. It's probably the only scenario I can honestly endorse drinking a little bit of it too. After we left the locker room, the surgeon and I looked at each other, and he said the only negative sentence I heard him utter in 2.5 years of working together. That was bad. The next morning, the entire department, a fairly large floor within the hospital, still reeked. The housekeepers told me later that it took them nearly an hour to suction all the fluid and debris that was left behind. The OR suite itself was closed off and quarantined for 2 more days, just to let the smell finally clear out. I laugh now when I hear new recruits to healthcare talk about the worst thing that they've seen. You ain't seen shit, kid. I am an extremely outdoorsy female and love to spend a lot of time in nature. I spent the better part of my early 20s living in the remote northern locations and exploring a lot of Alaska, Yukon, and BC. I have many odd, frightening, and bizarre stories that came from my time in the north, and this is one of them. In the summer of 2012, when I was 22, I was living and working in a pretty remote town in northern British Columbia from May to September. The place I worked at was a campground in a provincial park on the Alaskan Highway, 4 hours north of Fort Nelson and 2 hours south of the Yukon/British Columbia border. The best part about the park was the fact that it had a beautiful natural hot springs, which attracted tourists from all over North America every summer. I lived in an old trailer on a separate part of the campground, where the rest of the staff lived. I quickly got used to living in a place that had no running water, no electricity, no cell phone service, and no internet. And driving 4 hours to Fort Nelson every 2 weeks to get groceries and do my laundry, life was pretty sweet. I got to hike, go for late night dips in the springs, and make some traveling friends, and spend quality time in nature, getting to know the flora and fauna of the landscape. My job at the campground? Park facility operator, which was general maintenance and cleaning of campsites, as well as gatehouse attendant, wildlife interpreter, and sometimes I had a few security shifts here and there. The feeling of living in the woods was so completely different than the feeling of living in a city, as far as safety goes. In the city that I'm from, there are people around, and you are aware of the fact that your house or apartment could get broken into, but emergency services are pretty quick to respond, and neighbors are also a big plus. However, in the woods, I felt very vulnerable. The closest police were 4 hours away, and I lived in a trailer that was run down enough that it could easily be broken into. Not to mention it was pretty dark, which made it all the easier to sneak around at night. I was already on edge sleeping every night. The trailer next to mine was abandoned by the previous manager of the campground, after his son had shot himself in the head inside of it. The previous manager had promised numerous times he would hire a company to drive up from Fort Nelson and tow the trailer away. But that never happened. Not whilst I lived there, at least. And nobody seemed to care about it too much. I went into the trailer once, saw the blood and brains were still on the wall, and never went back again. Back in the 90s, there was also a fatal bear attack at the hot springs. We all had to read the incredibly gruesome and detailed police report for our bear aware training. So yeah, unsettling to say the least. One night, at probably around 2 in the morning, I'm asleep inside my trailer and am woken up by a very loud banging on the trailer door. Reasonably shaken, I look outside the window next to my bed, and I see a car with its lights on and 2 men standing at my door. I can feel the blood drain from my face. This is the moment I've been scared of the entire summer. Through the door I say, "How can I help you?" And one of the guys, clearly hammered out of his mind, starts rambling on about something. No matter how hard I try, I cannot understand what he is saying. I say, "Sorry, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." And the other guy starts frantically trying to explain something in the same drunken state as the first guy. I decide at this point that they don't mean any harm, and I open the door to speak to them. They look visibly shaken, and I can tell that they are desperate for my help, but don't have the mental capacity of a sober person enough to coherently tell me what is wrong. One of the dudes starts telling me a very long story that I managed to piece together through all of his slurring and hiccuping. Basically, he says that him and his friend are on vacation, and they came up from Fort Nelson to party. They had a really long drive, but were at the hot springs and they were having beers. And they were sorry about having beers. They weren't drunk, clearly. And then he drops the bomb that someone is running around the camp, stabbing people. I look at the guy telling me the story, and I notice that he has blood all over his clothing. I say, "Someone is going around stabbing people?" And he replies, "Yes, someone's running around stabbing everyone." Then the other guy yells, "Come on, let's go." And they hop into the aforementioned car and sped off, before I got a chance to question them further. Now I'm standing at my trailer door, in the darkness, alone, thinking that there's a maniac running outside wielding a knife. I have no phone, and I know that the only person who has a phone is the ranger, and his cabin is about a 5-minute walk away from my trailer. I remember at that point that I do have a radio, so I run inside my trailer, lock the door, and try and get the ranger on the radio. Of course, his radio is switched off, and the only thing I think I can do at this point is to go to the ranger's cabin and notify him of the situation. I slip out of my trailer and run through the darkness across the maintenance ground, past the creepy suicide trailer, and through a thicket straight towards the ranger's cabin. Every single noise I hear from the surrounding forest is making my heart pound faster. I keep imagining this maniacal man sneaking through the bushes, entering people's tents, and slashing everybody like some bad horror film. I get to the ranger's cabin and pound on his door. He answers within a few minutes, visibly sleep deprived, and I tell him the whole story. Whilst I'm there, he calls the police, and he tells him that they are on their way and will be there in 4 hours. The ranger grabs his gun, walks me to the back of the trailer and says, "Don't let anybody in." I stay up the rest of the night, listening for any sort of disturbance around me. The intense kind of listening, where you're concentrating so hard on any external sounds that might be made, that you almost feel death from the silence. After about 2 hours of doing this, my trailer starts rocking back and forth. I freeze. My heart drops. I can hear the sound of someone breathing extremely heavily, and I'm thinking, this is it. The knife-wielding maniac is going to murder me, and this trailer is going to have to be another one which they will have to tow away. I'm just sitting there on my bed, in my trailer as it's rocking, waiting for the maniac to stop tormenting me and just break the window and stab me. I am listening intently to the heavy breathing, and that's when I hear a grunt. A very non-human sounding grunt. I get a feeling that it's not what I think it is, and I peer out of the window, and I see a bison is scratching its back on the side of my trailer, causing it to rock back and forth. The RCMP get there around 6:30 AM and proceed with their investigation for about 10 hours. They close off the springs and the entire campground turns into an episode of CSI. We don't hear anything about what took place during the night until the investigation is over. Apparently, there was a guy at the springs who made a lewd comment about one of the females in another group, which resulted in an argument. The guy disappeared and returned an hour later with a knife, stabbed 2 of the guys in the group, and booked it back to Fort Nelson. Not before stopping at my trailer with his buddy to tell me, of course, of the incident. Yeah, one of the guys at my trailer. He was the dude stabbing people. My guess is that him and his friends stopped by my trailer to try and make it look like they were innocent. Drunken logic. The 2 guys that were stabbed survived, which is good. For many days following this incident, I was cleaning up blood-soaked clothing and rags from all random places over the campground. Let me preface this by saying, I am by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in paranormal ghosts, demons, or aliens or whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween. I have to admit, it's had me scratching my head ever since. So it had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighborhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas drop off in ours and constantly parade at our door. That night, I'd say we had no more than 8 to 10 groups of kids. It was around 9:30, and my husband and I were sitting in our family room watching some of the ghost shows based on, supposedly, actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but I do like a good ghost story now and then, and it is Halloween after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over half an hour. It was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light on and let our dog Chloe out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and is very docile. We only put her in the crate because we were afraid she'd try and get out and play with all the other kids, and I didn't want to have to chase after her down the street. I also didn't want her scaring or intimidating the kids, because she can be a little scary. So I turned the outside light off, let Chloe out, and she followed me back to the couch and lay down on my feet. It was getting close to 10 PM when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night, and was going to go upstairs, take a shower, and get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday, and he still had to get up early for the next day. Our teenage son was out with his friends at the local haunted house and wasn't expected back for at least another hour or so. So that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, Just because I don't believe doesn't mean that those shows don't freak me out a bit. And being alone now, I have to say I was kind of on edge watching the TV. It wasn't long until I heard the upstairs shower turn on, when the light came on in the patio. Knock, knock, knock at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell? Really? It's almost 10. Go home. But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows in the dark, and without the porch light, it would have been extra obvious to everyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door had a big glass panel, and everyone right by the door could easily see inside and know that I was just sitting there watching TV. It would have been rude for me not to answer. Just before I get up, knock, 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 again from the door. I glanced down at Chloe, but she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room and found her crouching by the back door, like she was wanting out. However, she needed to ask to go out like that. She always comes to lick my hand or puts her head on my knee. This was very out of character for her, and I have to say it heightened my anxiety. Chloe? Crate, I said. She just turned back to look at me like, hell no, lady. I ain't moving. I yelled up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, knock, knock. About the time a car drove by our street and cast enough light on the door for me to see the silhouettes of two small children through the glass. I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably a couple off my neighborhood on their way back home and wanted to stop by and show me their costumes or something. I headed for the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't following. What a great watchdog, I thought I had to myself. She just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough I could see through the glass. It was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and began to wonder about what kind of parents would let their kids run around the streets this late at night. I opened the door, enough to see where I could block Chloe's escape if she decided to grow some balls, which was only about 2 feet. What struck me immediately as odd was that the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were wearing normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick or treat either. I began to feel very uneasy. It was a girl and a boy. The girl to my left was older, I'd say around 11 or 12. I could tell she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features, as our lights are from high above and on the columns at the front of the porch, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I had not opened the door wide enough for any of the light to come inside and hit them. The boy was younger, about a foot shorter, and between 8 or 9 I'd say, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can we please come inside and use your phone to call our mother?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me that something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time I'd had anyone ask me to use my home phone. Hun? Don't you have a phone of your own that you can call your mum on?" I asked this, and that is when things got really weird. Both kids turned to look at one another, as if they were going to say something, but neither ever spoke. They both turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here, and my brother is scared." I have to admit,
There were two competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart and wanting to help these two small children get to their mother. The other, a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then I noticed that during the short conversation I'd already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and they looked at each other again. After a short moment they turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside whilst you call our mother?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer to the door, almost as if she was going to walk in. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes. That's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror I don't think I've ever felt before in my life. I could feel every hair on my arm and back of my neck standing at attention. I closed the door to where my face was just able to stick out. The little girl stopped again and pleaded, "Please, ma'am, we're really scared and alone out here. We have to come inside. Please, help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when the fear took over, and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mum if you give me the number," I shouted through the door. "But I'm not letting you in my house." I could still see them standing there on the porch, just staring at me through the Bellevue glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but the bigger part didn't want to lose track of where they were. That would have freaked me out even more, to know that they were not there. After what seemed like forever, but probably a few seconds, I decided to call my neighbour that lived across the street, as I made my way to the side table by our couch to get my phone. I glanced back to the door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room under the bed. When I got my phone and started to look for his contact info, it was when the kids had stepped away from the door and had begun walking into the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look of who they were and where they went, still not calling my neighbour. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough detail to make out people's shapes, but you couldn't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were standing under the street lamp, nearest my house, staring at me. As I lifted the phone to my ear after calling them, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbour out under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, and had never even heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think, what I have to think, is that these kids were just yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them, they were really, really good at it, and they scared the shit out of me and my dog, black-eyed kid or not.
I grew up on an island in Alaska and lived on the same property since birth to high school graduation. Our house had 2 stories, and the downstairs had a bathroom, furnace room, storage room, entryway, and rec room. One of the walls had some plywood pieces up, so that we could feed extension cords through it to our crawl space. We had a C-shaped driveway that you could enter from one side and then park in the carport and then just drive towards the exit. The crawl space consisted of 2 big water tanks because we caught our own rainwater. We also used this area for storage. The space was 10 by 15, but only 3 feet high. You had to lift a cover up to get into the water tanks, and you could only enter the crawl space from the side of the house. It was a 2 by 2 door that we kept a master lock on but never actually locked. Our dog Brewster had an area to the side of the house as well. He had a big fenced area, his own stairway and porch, which was half covered, and he had a doghouse. During the summer, we had black bears in our yard most nights, and Brewster would give a quick bark to let them on their way. We knew his barks. There were 4 of us in the family: my parents, myself, and my older brother, who is 2 years older and has Down syndrome. My brother was in special education at school, and there were other kids who would come into the same room, but just once in a while throughout the day, because they had similar disabilities and were able to keep up some of their general classes. But some of the kids had discipline problems or mental illness. My brother was loved by the school kids, and everyone knew him. One day, a native kid that was about 15 came to our door and wanted to play with Travis. We thought it was odd, because Travis had moderate Downs, and he didn't really like playing with other kids. He liked watching kids play. Travis liked watching movies and listening to music. My mum asked the kid what his name was, and he said he was Mark, and he knew Travis from junior high the year prior, because he would go into Travis's class sometimes for help with his homework. I remember him staring at me a little too much, and he didn't seem like someone who was mentally challenged. My mother let him come in but kept a watchful eye on them. Travis seemed like he didn't want him there, and my mum told Mark that we were having dinner soon and told him it was time for him to go. My mum found out that he had moved into the area where we lived, but it was still a little away. He had been in and out of foster care for most of his life. His parents were abusive addicts. I think he came over another time and my mum felt bad for him, and she really felt as if something was off. She felt like he was coming over because of me. My mum politely told him that Travis didn't really like having visitors, and he seemed okay with that, and never came over again. My parents went to a church service on Wednesday evenings, and would be gone a couple of hours. I would stay home with Travis. At the time I was 11 and he was 13. I started helping out the church nursery when I was 9, and when I turned 11, my best friend and I took a babysitting course, which included CPR and first aid. We would babysit together, and at age 12 started babysitting on our own. My mum was a homemaker, and would always be home except for Wednesday's church service. My parents didn't drink, didn't do drugs nor smoke, and I can only remember my parents going out a few times when we were in need of a babysitter. I would leave the downstairs door unlocked for my parents when they were going to be gone only a couple of hours. I was expecting them home in half an hour, and was surprised when I heard the downstairs door open. I thought I must not have heard the car pull up, and Travis was up past his bedtime, so I quietly tell Travis to go to his bedroom and get to bed. I start walking through the kitchen to the top of the stairs, and I call out, "Mom? Dad?" And I hear the footsteps stop. And I'm looking down the stairs, and I can see men's work boots and jeans. This is not my parents. The way the stairs are set up, you could see the bottom half of someone without descending the stairs. I'm scared to death, and I run to Travis, who is going down the hall, and I grab him and drag him to my parents' bedroom, because it's the only room that locks and has a phone. Now, I don't mean this in a rude way, but Down kids can be very stubborn, so my brother just wants to go to his room. But I get him to sit down on the bed, and I'm trying to keep him in the room whilst I'm grabbing a gun. and I call my neighbour. I can hear him walking around downstairs still. My neighbour answers her phone immediately, and I whisper to her that someone is in the house and that I'm scared. She told me to come out onto the front porch and she'll be there. I get the courage to run down the door and I get outside. Thankfully she's in our driveway and she has her hound dog with her. She lets me know that she's going to enter the house through the downstairs. She disappears from sight but comes back quickly and tells me that the door is locked, so she makes her way upstairs. She gets to the top when we hear the downstairs door open and the crunching of gravel as the intruder runs off. She lets go of her dog and the dog chases the person into the woods. The dog came back 10 minutes later and our neighbour sat with us until my parents got home. The police were never called because I think my parents assumed it was a neighbour's boy screwing with me. We live in a safe place where the only thing you have to worry about are bears and an occasional wolf. A week after this incident, our dog would bark for 15 minutes after we went to bed, consistently every night. We would look out the windows and saw nothing. We figured it was bears because it was springtime and Brewster's was probably just getting used to them again. A couple of months the barking still happened. I had my best friend stay the night, and we would always stay in the downstairs so that we can be louder and stay up as late as we'd like. Kate had a brother that was 7 years older, and we'd ask him to bring us booze. All the kids were starting their vices at our age. It was a little after midnight, and her brother never showed up, and Brewster never barked that night either. We were sitting on the stairs braiding each other's hair when we both got a feeling as if someone were looking at us. We looked over and there was a guy staring into the window. We ran upstairs in panic. We thought perhaps it was her brother, but he wouldn't have come to the window and spy on us. The face also seemed a bit darker than his, but we had the lights on downstairs and there were no lights by that window outside, so it was hard to tell who it was. We didn't want to wake my parents up just in case it was her brother, so we waited 30 minutes and went back down to grab our stuff and went to sleep in my bedroom for the night. The next day we spoke to her brother and he said it wasn't him. That night, Brewster's was back to barking again. 2 more months go by and I had gone to bed and heard Brewster's bark, and I looked out my window and as usual didn't see anything. I had just dozed off again and woke up to Brewster's barking frantically. I looked out my window and I see a guy running out of our driveway. I thought about waking my parents, but we had a trail on the side of our house that kids used to use to run to the road behind ours. The neighborhood was on the side of a mountain, so all the kids used trails to get straight through to another road instead of using the main roads. I'd never seen someone come out of that part of the driveway because the trail was on the south side of the house, along with the crawl space and Brewster's area. My room was the only room on the north side. I decided to go back to sleep and was tossing and turning. 15 minutes go by and I smell smoke. I go to the hall and the smell is a lot stronger, and it's starting to get hazy in Travis's room, which was directly across from mine. I scream, "Fire! Fire! Wake up!" My parents are up, but Travis doesn't want to get out of bed. But thank God for the strength of adrenaline. We get outside and the flames were pouring out of the crawl space. We get Brewster out of his enclosure, and the neighbors all come out to help us. The firemen were there rather quickly, but the fire had destroyed the crawl space and my parents' and Travis's rooms because they were directly over it. The firemen got the fire out, thankfully, and nobody was physically hurt. This was one of the scariest nights of my life though. I always remember the fire chief kneeling down to speak to me after he'd spoken to my parents, and he said, "Hey Melinda, we believe it was arson." I looked at him with tears streaming down my face and I say in anger, "Who is arson?"
Everyone started laughing so hard. And I'm thinking, how is it funny? That damn arson could have killed our family. So he explains what arson is. I'm still actually friends with the old fire chief's son, and I share that story with him often, because his father passed away from cancer when we were teens. His father is the only happy memory I have from that horrific night. The island I grew up on had a city and a village out south. We lived out south, but before the village. We had firemen for the south, north, and the city. We had state troopers for the island, and the city cops in the city limits. My mum took my brother and I to our family friend's house, and my dad dealt with the fire officials, and the state troopers showed up later. After the investigation, my family, neighbours, and firemen pieced together that a person had been living in our crawl space for at least 4 months. We knew he set the house on fire on purpose. He used a box of matches. My mum said the first odd thing she noticed was that at night she smelled sulphur. We also knew who did it. It was Mark. His uncle was one of the first firemen who showed up at our house and saw him standing near our driveway watching. My mum had told him my description of what the person was wearing that I saw fleeing from our house, and it was what he was wearing. Behind our house near the crawl space area, my dad found out where he hung out when he wasn't at the crawl space. There was a bunch of cigarette butts, soda cans, which were all found near there. But because our crawl space wasn't locked, our insurance company wouldn't have paid for the repairs. Because of our water tanks, the space was supposed to be locked. So my parents never said anything to the police, and the firemen never said anything. By pursuing this, we could have not had a home, a house my father had built. It took 4 months for our house to be repaired, and it smelt like ozone even years later. What bothers me the most is knowing that he had seen me and my friends undressed numerous times whilst changing in the rec room during tons of sleepovers. Where he had set up shop was right next to the plywood with the holes drilled through. He listened to all our secrets. I never explained to my friends that he'd seen us and heard us during our sleepovers, because I didn't want them to feel sick to their stomachs like I did. I still have issues when it comes to being home alone. I can't sleep if I'm the only adult in the house. I keep the volume on everything very low, and I'm scared to shower. I like to be able to see the front door, and I have night terrors to this day. I'm 34 now, and I've been dealing with the anxiety since the fire and panic attacks since I was 18. Just recently, I was diagnosed with PTSD. When the intruder was in his early 20s, he was caught for burning down a house and was put in jail. All of my childhood toys were stored in the crawl space, along with a lot of our family's sentimental possessions. But ultimately, I lost a hell of a lot more than just some possessions that night. You thought you were done? Ha! Not even close. Follow me over to my channel, where Being Scared and I have even more stories in the rain. Best bring your umbrella though. We're going to be there a pretty long time. See you soon.